Welcome, Jon Alba. For video folks, that is not Andrew Zarian. That is Jon Alba. When did when did that thing happen? You had met Andrew somewhere, and you guys were just taking pictures.
No, it happened before we even met.
Oh, really?
The internet was just trying to will that into existence, and then when we physically met in person, then we had opportunities to take pictures galore. And then last week, I got dinner with him, and someone actually photoshopped our faces on each other's bodies, and it looked like it could have been totally legitimate. You would have never known our bodies were exactly the same with the different heads on them.
My favorite one is the picture that you have with his wife.
Oh,
Jessica.
yes.
That one was hilarious.
She's like a night out with the hubby. Yeah, that was a good one.
So thanks for doing this. We've chatted before a couple times on We're Live, pal. I've hung out with you in line waiting for I think is that All Out?
It's All Out. It was Brawl Out.
Yeah, exactly. And we're gonna talk some wrestling here. We have to talk a little bit of wrestling, but I'm so fascinated by the journalism aspect, by the content creator aspect, by the host aspect of your career. So I'm definitely going to hit on a lot of that stuff. But, this is generally a wrestling podcast. So I'm going to hit you with a few things early on. And let's take it back. And I usually kind of save this question for the end, but I think it will fit better here in the beginning. What is your first pro wrestling memory?
1997. October 5th, 1997, Bad Blood, Hell in a Cell, Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker. That's got to be Kane. That was the night that hooked me.
So how old are you at this point?
Do you want me to say that?
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer that?
Well, you're a pretty young dude.
I'm 30, so I was 4 years old. I was 4 years old.
So I knew your age and I knew the time frame, but the reason why I wanted you to say that is because you're a 4-year-old, and we are right in the precipice of the Attitude Era, right?
Yep.
So
probably shouldn't have been watching, but what are you gonna do?
Yeah, but we were all watching stuff at a young age that we shouldn't have been watching.
Tell people. I try to tell young people that too, who are like getting into wrestling, that legitimately everyone and their mother was watching pro wrestling from 1997 to 2001, and when pro wrestling was outdrawing Monday Night Football. I think that says something in and of itself.
So I have two kids who are, you're actually closer in age to my kids than you are to me. That's I want to say that there. So my kids are in their early 20s.
Okay.
My oldest will be 24 in a few weeks. And I remember, when they're growing up, the iPhone is just like the thing. It's becoming like the utility gadget of our lives. And I remember they're in the music, and they're young when Jay-Z and Kanye's Watch the Throne comes out. So I'm thinking like I'm cool parent, right? So I buy the normal version for myself, and then I buy the version with the with the curse words blurted out for them. And I'm thinking like, oh, I'm cool parent. And then I realize, I'm like, wait, they have an iPod, which has access to a web browser. Then they were soon to get their phones, which, have access to. And I'm like, why even? Like, what is the maybe to make me feel good so I can tell the story to other parents.
The right thing as a parent, right?
But it's the wild, wild west with what people can watch. And I always remember, I think it was the UK would say, oh yeah, like we have nudity on our TV, like no big deal. And they're like, and so when that happens, when you're younger and you kind of see this, when you get older, like it's no big deal. We saw this stuff when we were kids. Yeah. So I kind of wonder if that effect happens more so these days, because I'm older than you, obviously, but growing up, it was like this. There was this time and place where everybody was afraid that their kids were going to get kidnapped. And so you have these overprotective parents. And then, so how do
history repeats itself, huh?
Right. So but I do wonder, like, if you grew up in the Attitude Era, like nothing that happens in pro wrestling today can really offend you or surprise you or alarm you. Like, you've seen it all.
I don't know if I'd say that nothing offends you, because I think you can look back objectively on that era and decide for yourself what was kosher and what wasn't, right? You can look back and say, that really doesn't age very well. And there's a lot of that stuff that really doesn't age very well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We did a rewatch on our Patreon. We did 97 and 98 back to back over the last 2 years. Some stuff there, man. And even stuff that's like you cannot find the Degeneration X doing the Nation of Domination. It's not on the Peacock feed anymore. They just eliminated it.
As they should have.
Right.
Just how it is. We look back. I was with a buddy last night and we watched Me, Myself, and Irene, the old Jim Carrey movie from 2000. And I that movie's like a guilty pleasure of mine. But it was my first time watching it in a really long time. And I'm watching, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is just even the year 2000. And so much of this stuff ages so poorly. So yeah, when you talk about it in that prism, we did see a lot of crazy, crazy stuff. But I do think you can be objective and say, that really doesn't age all that well all these years later. And if someone were to try something like that again, just for the sake of the shock value, I don't know how much equity it would carry.
Yeah, it's crazy because you have something like Twitter and Facebook, and your thoughts as, when I'm growing up, like I have these thoughts and I'm learning, but I don't have a place to write them down and put them into like a historical database, right? Like my thoughts are just like my thoughts and they change and I grow up and I go, okay, I might have thought this, but now it's really this. But now these people on social media, every single thought or frustration or happy moment is just sort of cataloged forever. In some cases forever. I mean, if you're slick enough, you can get out of there early. But like, imagine being on Twitter in the early days and saying a joke that now in 2023 is not a good joke anymore. And that thing is just immortalized.
And even so, too, like people make honest mistakes in things they say. Sometimes someone will say something, not realize entirely. I'm guilty of it myself. You say something, you put it out there, and you're like, oh, you know what? Actually, I can see how that can be misconstrued, or that's not what I was actually trying to say, or maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I didn't read something all the way through, and I'm like, oh, I should recant that. And but it's out there, right?
Exactly.
And I mean, we're human. We make mistakes. We're honest people, or you try to be an honest person. And man, I've been on the receiving end of that many times. It's to the point where it's cost me opportunities.
Wow.
Personal opportunities where I make a very innocent comment that is not meant with ill will. And you're like, oh, wait, you know what? Actually, and I mean, that happens. I see it all the time, too, amongst peers.
I try to go as many podcasts as I can without mentioning the name Dave Meltzer, but he's just a lot of his work is just in everything that we do. But I like to read old observers for research purposes, and I'll ask him sometimes. I'm like, really, the flabulous mullah, the junk food dog, and he's like, well, back then you're writing for comedy, and the tastes are much different.
And a lot of the stuff Dave wrote was really bad taste.
And he's like, I'm writing that stuff not only to make myself laugh, but also I kind of know who's reading, and the people get a kick out of it. So it's, writing, thinking, having the foresight in 1984 is impossible to how your work translate 40 years later. But yeah, I mean, for them, like for the Wrestling Observer, they could have, gone through that stuff with a fine-tooth comb, and they're like, nope, let's just put it up. It's just history. It's what it is. But yeah, so that is a whole other conversation, not one that I want to have with you today, but it could be a fascinating podcast down the line. Okay, so you are obviously involved in many projects within the wrestling business. You mentioned 1997. Hell in a Cell as your first real dug-in memory of pro wrestling.
My big bang moment, I call it.
Now, you grow up through the Attitude Era, through the post-2000 WWE. There's no WCW anymore. It's really WWE and then TNA if you're watching TNA. But like, how do you watch wrestling today versus how you were watching it as a fan? Because I imagine it's so vastly different in how you're watching it today.
There's two elements to that. There's the media critic in me. There's the person who watches it from that avenue. But then there's also something that it's funny. I've been doing this for so long, and I think there's a lot of people who still don't fully know this about me. But I've been working in indie wrestling for going on 8 years now, where I've been a manager. I've been part of creative for multiple promotions. I've wrestled matches, one-offs for comedy more than anything. I'm involved coaching with the Monster Factory right now. So the way that I watch wrestling, honestly, I watch it almost like how a pitching coach would watch a pitcher and try
Right.
to identify things in storytelling, in movement, and that's how I consume it. That's how I digest pro wrestling. I do a thing on my Patreon, the Wrestling According to Alba Patreon, that I do every week called Tape Study, where I will pick a match and we'll break down a match move for move and say, okay, why does it make sense to do a side headlock takeover coming out of this? And that's something that I think a lot of wrestling fans, if you're like a diehard wrestling fan, you crave something like
Yeah.
that. Like, oh yeah, but be a nerd with me, right? And that was kind of something I learned from my time as a producer at MLB Network. I was producing television for Pedro Martinez,
Yeah.
for the likes of that, where I'd be in production meetings and Pedro would be talking about the difference between releasing a ball here versus releasing a ball here. And all of a sudden, that gets my brain going and saying, wow, I never thought about how that might even affect something. And that's kind of how I consume wrestling as a result.
That is an amazing answer. I did not know that you were going there, but I'm glad you did, because that kind of leads to my next point, which is wrestling today is very different than it was, and in really positive ways. And sometimes, I think people wish that the product was a little bit different, but you have these two competing products. Obviously, WWE is so uber successful that they're just in a different stratosphere. But you have this up and comer, AEW, who's been around now for 4 years, and they've really cemented themselves as maybe the most solid number 2 organization, in forever. But if you watch an AEW match with the fundamentals as you understand professional wrestling, sometimes they do what you wouldn't suggest fundamentally because of kind of what their crowd is into. So how do you reconcile that when you're watching these shows?
I think companies play and should do this. Companies should play to their audience, play to the people who are willing to pay lots of money to see you. I don't have an issue if a company structures the majority of its matches to appeal to certain demographics or certain audiences, because if those people are willing to pay money to see them and to keep them going, well, then I understand it. If AEW had matches that were all in the same vein of every major WWE match, what would be the point of AEW existing?
Yeah.
That's how I look at it. So I have a deep appreciation for how different companies have matches. Are there styles that I don't love? Sure, there are styles I don't love that don't appeal to me personally. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to sit here and invalidate that form of the art. That's kind of the way that I look at it. And I think we live in an era now where, too, there is so much hybrid product out there. WWE, back in the Attitude Era, you turn it on, you were lucky if you got a match over 5 minutes on Raw.
Yeah.
Now,
without multiple run-ins and
run-ins or
chaos at the end.
DQs or whatever, right? Now, this past week, they just said Gunther and Kevin Owens tear it down, right? And that's a type of match that plays to an AEW fan base audience. But we see more variety, and I think that's a good thing, and that's how I consume the product. I'm very open-minded. I believe that anything can be wrestling as long as there's proper thought put behind it. I do a podcast with Broken Matt Hardy.
Yes,
if
exactly.
that can be wrestling, then I'm genuinely very open-minded.
Oh, we'll get to that. I can't wait to talk about that. But it's funny you mentioned this last Raw, because I watched the Kevin Owens and Gunther match, and I was like, this was really, really good. The finish sucked. I kind of expected the finish to suck. But then by the time the Seth Rollins and Damian Priest match came on, I was like, not ready for another 20-minute match. I was like, I got mine. Now let's see something happen here. What's going to happen? And that was sort of my instinct watching it. And I don't know if that's just because I've watched so much WWE in the past that I'm sort of trained. My brain is trained to think that. And then they went, they had another good wrestling match, but I was like, I was kind of okay with that Kevin Owens and Gunther one, and I wanted to see something different, which I don't know if other people feel that way. But so I was explaining to my wife, because she came with me to Double or Nothing. She'd never been to a wrestling event before. She'd wanted to go because Meltzer's significant other had asked her to come. She's like, I'm going to be in Vegas. Do you want to come? We'll do spa day. And I don't really like to pressure her to have anything to do with this stuff. Like, because I'm caught up in so much, I'm a giant Warriors fan.
You don't want to expose her to the booger eaters, as
well, no, it's not even that, because she has a good understanding, because she taught English in Korea for a year.
You get storytelling, okay,
and she has recollection of like 12 and 13-year-old boys and what they were into in the early 2000s. And it was American wrestling. It was WWE. So she like understands like the draw of it, but she had never been to a live show. And so I was trying to explain to her, the difference between WWE and AEW. And I was saying how, Vince McMahon trained his audience to like a specific style. He was very diligent in promoting that style. And like now the fan base really has an understanding of the product that he's putting out there, for better and for worse. And in AEW, Tony has to cater to all the other wrestling styles in the world. And so it's a much harder job for Tony to appease so much variety, because if you're a lucha fan, you'll like the lucha stuff, but you'll also understand that it's a very rare occasion when those guys are going to get a big win over an American star. And now we have the Forbidden Door show coming, and you have the New Japan style. And I think Tony is willing to book some of the New Japan folks because of that partnership over some of his guys. But like, if you come into it as like, I like this style, you're not always going to see your favorites win. And so Tony has to figure out how to make all of these different people happy, which is a really hard job, I think, versus Vince is like force feeding us for the last 50 years and saying, okay, you just have to like what I'm giving you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that assessment is 100% accurate. I think that's part of the reason too, why, I saw a lot of people say they didn't like the Chris Jericho and Adam Cole unsanctioned match. And the reason I think that's the case, and I was having this conversation with one of my patrons, actually, who's a very intelligent, smart wrestling fan. And he brought this point up, and I tried to dig a little deeper into it. That unsanctioned match that we saw between Chris Jericho and Adam Cole, I didn't think it was a bad match, but it was a match that you could have seen on Monday Night Raw in 2001.
Sure.
The way it was laid out, the way it was structured. The ladder match, the Christian Cage and Wardlow ladder match. I like that ladder match, for the record. I thought it was different than a lot of AEW ladder matches. But the reason it was different than a lot of AEW ladder matches is because it had more the vibe of a story-driven ladder match that you probably would see on WWE TV back in 2005. That's not what the AEW audience is used to when you're talking an unsanctioned match or a ladder match. They went a more classic WWE story-heavy approach in their respective matches. And that, I think, didn't connect with the AEW audience. That's why I say, don't shy away from your audience. Don't shy away from your base. Give them what they want at the end of the day, and they'll leave happy. And I say that across all companies. Thank you for the little plug there. That's much appreciated. But yeah, you could legitimately send them home happy every time if you just give them what they want.
Right. And I put it on the video, but if you're listening on the podcast, and if you want to check out John's Patreon, patreon.com/wrestling according to Alba. And it looks like there's a few different price points.
Or even easier, wrestlingaccordingtoalba.com. If you like,
there you go.
A nice short URL.
Smart.
We're on top of that. Buddy.
Very smart. Very smart. No, it's a great argument. And what I find fascinating, and we'll sort of leave the pro wrestling product and dig into more stuff. But what I find fascinating is that now there's a lot of people who previously, like, because I've been doing sort of what I would call practice podcasts since I don't know 2008 or something, knowing that these things aren't going to see the light of day. Just try to figure out what works. We'll put them out to like a very small community, and then at some point, the syndication is just going to become easier, and we'll get it out there. That's pretty much what happened. But we as fans, like, this does happen in other sports, but this is actually a good question for you because you come from real sports as well. Do you think pro wrestling fans, because of the nature of not only the in ring but also the storylines, like, why do pro wrestling fans have that instinct to want to do a podcast or to create content or to have a YouTube channel versus like my dad watching the Giants? Like, he doesn't care for his thoughts to get out there except for to text me.
I mean, there are a lot of sports podcasts out there. There are many more sports podcasts than there are pro wrestling podcasts out there. And I think part of the reason for that, I call it the ESPNization of sports fandom, where since the whole embrace debate mentality came in, everyone wants a podcast where they can just give their thoughts on the sports world. And I get it. Listen, 2007, I think, was the first time I ever dabbled into sports broadcasting. Podcasting didn't exist then. It was legitimately online sports talk radio.
Yeah.
On
Totally.
really bad connection, and you would go live.
Were you a part of the blog talk radio community?
I was not, but I was a guest on shows on blog talk radio.
Yeah.
There was an old site called Ucaster that was a beta test that I got my start on, that so many people who started with me have gone on to do amazing things. It's so cool seeing that. But aside from that, my point here being, I think people have always wanted to be part of that space because you can give your opinions. As far as pro wrestling podcasting goes, I think that the different element of pro wrestling is it is scripted. So not only can a fan give their opinion of, I liked this or I didn't like this, they can also give their opinion on, here's how I would have done it different.
Right.
Where that doesn't exist in any other sports realm. And when someone is a creative type or wants to be a creative type and has that desire to put an opinion out there like that, well, that's where you get this cover. I mean, look at Will Washington. Will Washington was one of the guys who was doing this a long time ago, and it had merit because now he's one of Tony Khan's right-hand men. And
that story is fascinating, and I'm a big fan of his.
Very much so.
When was it be the first time I talked to him? It had to be at least on something like this. Had to be at least a couple years ago, and to see where he's gone, and you could sense his savviness going all the way back to, like you said, like way back, because he was doing video stuff like before most anybody else was. And I know Zarian Andrew said, that they both were into like some of the same stuff back then too, because in order to be able to do that stuff, you had to understand the tech side of things.
Yep.
And they both come from that background as well. So it's really great to see. No, but
I'm not convinced that Andrew Zarian is not part of the mafia, by the way. That's the point. I'm just putting that out there publicly so everyone's aware of that.
That would be great for We're Live, pal, if he was secretly. But if someone came to you and we'll talk about the other thing that you have going on, which is the Alba Media School. But if someone came to you and was like, John, I have this great idea for a podcast. Here's how it would be different. Here's what I would like to like. Do you have? I'm sure you get asked like, how do I do this a lot? I get asked from time to time too. And like, but like, how do you give advice on like, what do you tell them? Here's how I would do it, or here's how you could separate yourself, because there's many of them out there.
You said the big thing right at the beginning there was, how do you be different? Because that is the key in success in any element of broadcasting specifically, let alone podcasting. It's how are you different? What makes you stand out? What about your idea is different than everything that's already out there in the space? And I can't sit here and tell you what's going to work and what doesn't work. I've had projects where I thought we would be knocking it out of the park in terms of numbers, and it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
I have projects where I had very low expectations, and all of a sudden, I'll be very candid with you. I had no idea what to expect with Strictly Business with Eric Bischoff. Had no idea what to expect. Obviously, Eric's a big name, but a podcast that is kind of different. It's about the business side of pro wrestling.
Mhm.
I wasn't sure what kind of audience there was going to be for that, but we collaborated and came up with the concept, and it's been pretty successful so far. It's been more successful than the Hardy podcast. And the Hardy podcast, for me, that was like a no-brainer in
Yeah.
terms of what the structure was going to be, because I know the caliber of a storyteller that Matt is. I was like, this is how we're going to do this. And, just sometimes you never really know. Not to say it's not successful, but there are just so many out there. When we started doing the Wives of Wrestling podcast that I was doing, I thought that concept was going to be a home run.
That was a fascinating idea, for
And
sure.
I thought it was going to be a home run, and I still, for the record, think it can be, but just certain elements got in the way, and unfortunately, we weren't able to get it super far off the ground.
And also, you need, like, it's not just you who
Right.
drives it. There's multiple people you need buy-in from, and not everyone's on the same page all the time.
100%, and that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah.
For a project like that. But I still, I still think that there's a lot of good ideas that are untapped out there in not just the wrestling space in general. I don't want to give too much out there publicly, but like there are ideas that I've wanted to work on that I think come from the wrestling space that haven't been attempted in the pro sports space, that I'm like, this would work perfectly. And I've tried to get some stuff rolling with ideas like that. So again, I don't want to go too into specifics, but I think that we can all learn from. I think it's totally fine to draw inspiration from things that exist in other mediums,
Right.
and then make it your own. Find a way to make it unique. I think that's totally kosher.
Now, here's where I want to dig even deeper into what you do, because
I don't
you
even know what I do, so I'd love to dig further. Go ahead,
but
please.
you are hosting a few successful podcasts here. You are a host, a podcast host, but you're also a journalist. And then we sort of dovetail into the difference in content creation. But the one thing is that you are a professional voice. If people are listening to this, they can hear the difference between me hemming and hawing a little bit in trying to get my question out, and you taking a half a second in what you're going to say and using the same rhythm and using sentence structure. Nobody is hearing you say nobody is hearing you stumble over your words. You are a professional speaker, and that adds to your dynamic of what you can do better than other people. Now, not everyone's going to have that training. Not everyone's going to go through the same training that you did. But in order to do what you do, your voice is your instrument, and you have a polish that very few podcasters out there are going to have. That is what separates you in my eyes. But kind of explain that, because and the reason why I wanted to mention the whole wrestling podcast thing is because there aren't many professionals doing it. It is very much a starter
DIY.
kit, do it yourself, which is fantastic because you can get your voice out there. But there's also a polish to what you can do that not everybody can do.
And I'm very appreciative of everything you said, but for the record, I still and ah every now and then. I stutter words every now and then. I think human nature, that is just part of what we do and how we have conversation. There's one thing I want to push back on a little bit, where you're saying there's a difference in the voice. I developed this concept, and this is kind of part of some of my teachings that I do, that I work on with aspiring on-air talent specifically. Right. I call it the Mr. Rogers method.
There we go.
Mr. Rogers, we're all familiar with him, or if you're not familiar with him, do a Wikipedia of Fred Rogers.
Fascinating documentary that came out a couple years ago too.
Very fascinating. There was something about Fred Rogers' delivery and on-air presence that I always found to be so fascinating. And it was that when Mr. Rogers talked to you, you felt like he was speaking just to you. You could have been in a room of 30 kindergartners watching Mr. Rogers on TV, but you felt like he was speaking directly to you. He would try to avoid using plurals. He would say, "How are you, my friend?" versus "my friends."
Right.
Small things like that. I've tried to incorporate that in all of my on-air work. When I was hosting the 30-minute sports show in Orlando on TV, it was just me, solo, standing for 30 minutes.
Wow.
There'd be thousands of people watching this at any given time. And every moment that I stared directly into that camera, it was a conversation between me and that one person watching.
Right.
That, I think, is the difference between a polished broadcaster per se and maybe someone who's a little more DIY. And there's nothing wrong with that, for the record, at all. I think that people like listening to individuals who feel like they're communicating just with them individually. And you don't even think about it consciously. It's a very subconscious thing. I also have friends in the industry who, like, how I'm talking right now is how I sound in doing anything.
Right.
But I have friends in the industry who will be on air. And, the Yankees last night, they played the Blue Jays. And
that's not their voice.
That's like the old Walter Cronkite way of doing things, right? To me, that is a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And to each their own, they can have their own strategy, and many of them are more successful than I. I think it's important to be your most authentic and personal self. And sure, having the reps that I've had will help you. That, I think, is ultimately the difference between myself and maybe someone who's podcasting at home. If I was anchoring, my first on-air job, I was a sports director, so I was anchoring 3 times a night, 5 nights a week minimum. Put the math together, that's about 1,000 times on air a year.
Yeah.
Not more than that. That's the difference between how someone presents themselves on a more amateur level versus a professional level.
I had so much respect for people who were doing the on-air TV stuff when I was in college at San Jose State. I loved radio. I felt like, I think that, there's obviously a little bit of a shield or a disguise in radio that you don't have when you're doing TV. You are, just naked up there on TV. And I was always so impressed with the people who could do TV well, because there you had to fight through whatever that fear was, I guess is what you would call it. Like, you had to really be in love with the idea of this camera coming at you. And that was always hard for me. I didn't like doing TV. Even when we would have to do our weekend, our weekend TV broadcast for the station, I was always like, I'll do the least because I just don't like it. But I was so opposite on the radio stuff. Like, I just fascinated by radio. And I think it's probably because when I'm growing up, so this is the mid to late 80s, and I'm listening to baseball games.
Mm-hmm.
And those are my first storytellers.
Yep.
Those are the first people who actually pique my interest in using their voice to tell a story.
Radio play-by-play people are the most talented broadcasters in the industry.
I'm listening to Al Michaels' book, which was he probably wrote this book like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But the Audible version, he doesn't do every chapter. He probably does one every 4 or 5 chapters. But listening to his little insider tricks to the trade and stuff is awesome, because I was like, man, if I had access to this when I was still in college, just the little tidbits of knowledge. Like, he's not even trying to teach anybody how to do this. He's just kind of explaining his career. But the little things that he would do on radio versus on TV, because he does have like several paragraphs about the difference in how he saw his job being different in radio and television. But yeah, that was my first those were my first heroes were, whoever's doing Giants radio because, and this is so different than today. You couldn't get the home games on TV. So you would watch the away games on TV and you'd listen to all the home games on radio. And that's how I consumed, my local teams, back then. But going back to what you said, I I hope nobody took it as an affront that I was against do-it-yourself podcasters. My entire the network that this show is going to go on the audio side is full of do-it-yourself podcasters. There's very few of us who have had actual training in journalism or in radio, TV, film, or anything like that. It is really just the passion for what you want to talk about. And also, this comes up a lot when I talk to people who do this, the fandom of radio and specifically Howard Stern. That's Zarian. That's his biggest influence.
You're kidding me.
Dave Meltzer, Howard Stern. I loved Stern as well. But being in on the West Coast, I didn't really get to hear it until it was syndicated over here.
Yeah.
But, even people listen to Howard today, and he's a much different product than he was back then. It's so different. But he is still influential today. And it's not like you're influenced by him because he was on television or had a movie made. It's all through audio. And that's also fascinating to me.
You weren't a Private Parts fan?
No, I love Private Parts. I read the book. I read Miss America. I even recently downloaded, he put out a book a couple years ago where it was sort of the post Whack Pack stuff of his interviews. And so it's not as fun because, I'm not secretly laughing to myself like a child. But like, I just find that, you go back and Howard is, he used to say he was the king of all media. Really, he was the king of radio. And he was able to successfully do stuff in other forms of media. But it's the audio stuff that is what was influential no matter what. No matter how many TV shows he's tried to do, it's still the radio. I would rather hear him through my car speakers or my headphones than any other way. I don't even want to see him. I can visualize what he looks like when he's talking. And that is the part that, maybe people who are growing up in a little bit of a later era, that may not be as big to them because radio is not as big anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I totally understand everything you just said. I think that there were individuals who had a larger than life presence across that medium, and that's why they were able to find success. And they were innovators. Howard Stern was an innovator. And as a result, you see the impact that he has today. And you said learning from Howard Stern, you might not even be directly learning from Howard Stern as a broadcaster because Howard Stern may have directly impacted so many other broadcasters that you learned from.
Yeah, exactly.
So indirectly, you're learning from them.
So talking about both the Matt Hardy show and the Eric Bischoff show, what is the difference in preparation, or is it similar to how you prepare to do both shows?
Nope, totally different. Totally different. See, there's a number right there.
You get that one though, because I caught you a little off guard with the question.
Hardy show is significant amounts of preparation. I was just prepping before I got on here with you because we're going to tape tonight. I use a lot of my TV preparation with Matt Hardy. So my mentor in the industry is, if you're a sports fan, you know this name. If you're like an actual sports fan, Ian Eagle, who's
absolutely
a prolific play-by-play guy. He's my mentor. And the biggest piece of advice I learned from him when I was 15 years old was pre-production is production. The amount of work you put in ahead of time is going to ultimately reflect in your product. So with Hardy, I have a list of topics that I've planned out throughout the year. Then I will go, I'll lay out some opening topics because he likes talking some current events at the beginning. So we'll hit on some current stuff. And then I will spend hours and hours and hours digging through the topic of the day. I will go through different resources. I will watch material, whatever it may be. And I will jot notes down. Sometimes I'll write things in full. But and I was just tweeting about this today, actually. I would say of all the material that I collect for that, maybe 40% of it gets used. My interviewing style for podcasting and in general is entirely based in follow-ups. So I'll have a loose format of where I want to take our conversation, and it helps Matt know and where to jog his memory. But if he says something and I find something about what he said interesting, I'm going to follow up off that. And that will then guide the course of the conversation. I think that's what the best interviews are, when you're going entirely off follow-ups. I never pre-plan questions for any interview that I do. I might have an idea of things I want to talk about, but I will never pre-plan a question, because if you pre-plan a question, you are boxing yourself in and you will miss what they're saying. There's a free piece of advice for anyone who wants to do this. As far as Bischoff goes, Bischoff is much more go with the flow.
Mm-hmm.
He likes to really play it off the cuff. I will try to do a lot of the legwork in coming up with ideas for what we will talk about, but there's very little pre-production in terms of research and elements, because he really likes to go off the skin of his teeth and say what he's going to say. His show is very difficult to do. Eric Bischoff is a very difficult person to do a podcast with, and I don't mean that as a slight on him. It's certainly not. It's actually a compliment on him, because he's very quick, he's very intelligent, and I need to really be on my best, on my top of my game, and be ready to think on my feet with Eric, because I never know what he's going to throw back my way.
Yeah.
And that is a challenge, but it pushes me as a broadcaster to be better too.
And it makes it so much fun for you as well, because, you know, you're doing this and you want to present a good show. You want to present a good information, facts, but at the same time, if he says something that is not in your notes or that you weren't going with, and then you have to go there, you're I'm sitting up here now. I gotta, I really gotta focus on what he's saying versus, sort of my outline and where I want to go. That's got to be a challenge, like you said, but that's also got to be part of the charm of being able to do stuff with him.
It is, and Eric and I have very different perspectives of modern wrestling too. Very,
I can imagine.
So that can create tension sometimes, but that's good content at the end of the day. But if I'm going to come at him, I need to be convicted,
because he will be convicted.
I've never met someone with more conviction about things than Eric Bischoff. Even if Eric has no idea what he's talking about and he's bullshitting 100% of the way, I've never seen someone speak with more conviction. He could tell me, John, the sky is indeed green, and here's why. And he will say it with so much conviction that I'm like, I want to argue back, but I know if I do, it's just going to make me look stupid.
I'm rewatching the 96 Nitros and pay-per-views. So this is Eric. Eric's doing a better Vince McMahon than Vince McMahon at this point. Yeah. He is the lead play-by-play. So every single storyline direction is coming directly out of his mouth. He's trying to get over the baby faces. For some reason, he's also trying to get over Lex Luger, who's doing a heel character. He's also being sensitive to people hating on Lex. I'm waiting for the payoff on that one. I'm not exactly sure why it's happening, but he's doing such a good job at promoting, and we talked about this when we were talking AEW, WWE, the difference between WCW and WWF. Like, he's getting these points across. This is what you get with the old, and outdated WWF, and here's what you're getting with the new version, and the new version of WCW is really a lot of old WWF characters sort of reborn
with different shine on them, right?
With different shine. And so I say this because people who know us know that our podcast partners may not be the best of friends, especially on social media. So that I didn't want it to feel like there was an elephant in the room. But last year at All Out, we were talking about how we met there in person for the first time. You guys, the ad-free guys, had a convention at the same hotel that we were staying at. And so I got to see Eric And this man holds court. This dude is so damn
Yeah.
charming and personable
His
and
presence is remarkable, isn't it?
and likable. I was just amazed at because there's lots of wrestlers going in and out. Like John Morrison is hanging out and fist bumping with people, and there's lots of it was really like a cornucopia of like tons of wrestlers that you would remember who were there. Jeff Jarrett was there, and the single biggest star, I would say, to the fans that were there was Bischoff, and that is something, right? Like here's something that it doesn't really bother me, but I kind of think of it as a major what if. We had this WWF and WCW war going through until WCW gets bought out. And you have Eric Bischoff, who could have been like this, he's not going to be A1 to Vince's A2, but you could have created this storyline where these two heads of these companies are fiercely embattled. And I think they may have even wanted to go that way. But soon, Eric kind of becomes like more of a comedy character. And, Vince probably feeling very powerful at that moment. But it's just mind boggling to me that you had such a great performer who really couldn't be that same performer on WWF TV.
I don't think people recognize Eric for truly. Yeah, people I think look at Eric as the guy from WCW, and he was the man calling the shots. I genuinely, and this might be a controversial take, I believe the best Eric Bischoff is Eric Bischoff, the TV character.
He's
I think
100%.
Unbelievable as a TV character. From my indie work, there's no one I've borrowed more from than Eric Bischoff, the TV character, especially even Raw GM Eric Bischoff, because he rolled with everything.
Yes.
He did everything that was asked of him. He showed versatility. He showed range. That smile and the swagger
and the pointing to the dimple and the tilting the head. Yeah.
He was so, you just wanted to sock him across the face. That is the essence of a great pro wrestling character.
And you talk about somebody who took things from his previous training. He had modeled, so he knows how to stand in front of a camera. He knows the angles to show. He was doing the TV stuff from earlier before he became an executive. And so he had multiple talents. And, in the end, he's not going to be seen as the best businessman, but I do think he is so undervalued as an on-screen, on-air talent. Like, I get why he's not currently working in AEW. Like there's differences in what you want to portray in AEW, but I mean, there is room. If you're going to bring back Jeff Jarrett for a role in AEW, there is room for a Bischoff character too. You could have a small old school group there. But not saying that that's something that they should do.
WWE tried to do in 1998 with the NWA.
Yeah, totally.
And
so bad. They just wanted those guys to.
And ironically, Jeff Jarrett too.
And you say Jim Cornette. I was convinced in the early stages of AEW, and I had I'm close to Dave, so I would hear things, and Dave would hear things, and he'd tell them to me. So I had this concept of AEW before anybody really knew what AEW was. I was convinced that Jim Cornette versus the Young Bucks or versus the Elite was a fire program from day one.
I think a lot of people would have thought the same.
And they worked themselves into a shoot, and they ruined the whole thing. Now it may be okay for Cornette's podcasting career because he's got so many topics on top of topics to discuss about that stuff. But man, there is an aspect of AEW where I do wish there was an element, a little bit of more old school pro wrestling storytelling. But to Tony Khan's point, maybe that's what has failed pro wrestling in the past, and you need to constantly move forward. That was just to say, even though Dave and Eric don't really get along and they have their differences of opinions about things that happen, I just wanted to make sure people knew that I thought Bischoff was just fantastic
Yeah,
on screen,
yeah,
and I think he still has some value in
it's
today's wrestling.
funny that you bring all that up because I think Eric does respect Dave's knowledge of pro wrestling and Dave's vast historian-esque tome that he has built over time. I think Eric's issues with Dave stem from reporting over the years, and I think there were probably missteps in on both entities. I think both entities created issues with one another over the years. And listen, when you're a reporter at that level like Dave is, you are in a public light that is a very difficult place to be, especially in an industry that's real but that's also not real. It's a weird slope to try to walk, and there were times where I'm sure back in the 90s it was very beneficial for Eric Bischoff to talk to Dave
Oh,
personally,
yeah, absolutely.
and now it's on the other side of things.
And Dave would say the same thing about Vince McMahon. When Vince McMahon needed Dave as a mouthpiece to a specific set of fans, Vince would talk directly to Dave. That's just how it worked. And it's interesting because the whole media versus, I didn't even think about this until you just said that. The media and their relationship and their responsibility in pro wrestling. I was wondering if you found that different than in other
Yeah,
sports, because
yeah.
we have this CM Punk thing happening where CM Punk and FTR have kind of frowned upon the media. Brian Alvarez was the target in some instances, and I was trying to explain to some folks and saying how the relationship between media and talent doesn't need to be copacetic, but it needs to be beneficial and cooperative, because for the pro wrestlers, having a good relationship with the media means you're going to get covered, means it's going to be better for your business, the business of you, the business of CM Punk, the brand. If he's covered in a way where he's getting information out, that's free press in a sense. Not free, it's still his time and his relationships. But to be antagonistic towards that is what is sort of brought up. And that is what the Twitter fan base or whatever hears. And then you have this like butting of the heads of who's right, who's wrong, blah, 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 blah. And I was just telling some folks, like, I just wish it was different, because but I wonder if it's because pro wrestling is ultimately exists in kayfabe that you believed that this was the route that we're going in right now.
I think a lot of pro wrestling, be it from the wrestlers to media to fans, exists in a bubble. It is an industry built on a lie. It is
Yeah.
unlike anything else out there in the entertainment forum, in the sports forum. It's unlike anything.
Is there a magician newsletter out there?
Right. So, because of that, people often only know one way. I think for me, one of the things that I tried to bring with me as I emerged more in the wrestling space from the pro sports world was trying to show people, hey, there are different ways to cover this. There are different ways to go about this, positioning yourself in certain ways. And I agree with you. I think it's beneficial for wrestlers to leverage relationships with the media, not even just for favorable coverage, but because I think a wrestler putting themselves out there into that arena is more beneficial than even a pro athlete, because a pro athlete 95% of the time, unless you're talking like MMA or boxing or golf, even though who the hell knows what's going on with that now, but you're restricted to a team
Sure.
at the end of the day. Whereas here, as you kind of said, you are your own brand.
Yeah.
So I do think it's important to leverage positive relationships. And for even when someone misrepresents something, then you have something to stand on. I'll use an example.
That's the best point, and one that I was trying to make, where if something is misspoken, then you clear it up and then you get the right story out there.
I'll use an example. This past week's Hardy podcast, Matt made a comparison with Orange Cassidy and The Undertaker. Now, on the surface, you're like, what the hell, Orange Cassidy and The Undertaker? And so many wrestling fans saw a Wrestling Incorporated headline that said, Matt Hardy compares Orange Cassidy to The Undertaker without clicking, without listening, without all, ends up on Cornette's message board. All this stuff.
Yeah.
What Matt was saying was not, Orange Cassidy and The Undertaker are a lot alike. What he was saying was the relationship that Orange Cassidy has established with Tony Khan, where Tony Khan is actively depending on Orange Cassidy to go out there and be his guy on TV, be his ratings guy right now. And he asked him to wrestle a variety of different opponents in a variety of different types of matches. He says that is similar to what he witnessed with Vince and The Undertaker back in the day, where The Undertaker was always Vince's guy that Vince could count on to go out there in any segment, in any feud, and deliver for him. That's the comparison he was making. And I listened, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty cool. I never even thought of it like that. And I'm not there. So if he's saying this, then he has some perspective of this.
Right.
And he worked with both guys, so he has some perspective of that. But then you get all these websites who are, and listen, I get it. I understand. You're trying to provide
aggregation, baby.
Right. I get it. But there was one from Fightful, and I love Fightful. I think Fightful does an awesome job.
Fantastic.
But I felt they misrepresented the headline. And I wrote to the author of the piece. I was like, hey, just so you know, like, Matt has a great relationship with, different members of the media. And even he's feeling miffed about this because he feel like this was not representing what was actually discussed. And I had the conversation with the writer. I said, I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is your job. Here's the headline that I would have done for something like this, because this is what I think accurately reflects what was said. And they had a conversation internally and they changed their headline to accurately represent what was actually said.
Right.
Versus Matt Hardy compares these two characters, the Orange Taker.
That's actually a fascinating comparison, though, because the other thing that is similar is the spirit of the Orange Cassidy character is always there. And the spirit of the Undertaker existed until, just recently.
Well, and that's what Matt said too. He's like, on top of that, they're both outlandish characters that are always in all the time.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the point he was making. He was adding that on as an addition.
Right.
The point was about how Tony has relied on Orange Cassidy in that way. And he noticed that was similar how Vince relied on The Undertaker. And The Undertaker is going to be a wrestler that at the end of the history books will be 75 times more popular than Orange Cassidy, because The Undertaker is in that pantheon
iconic
of icons, right? But that doesn't mean that you have to discredit what Orange Cassidy is accomplishing right now in his own right.
No, not at all. Not at all. He's the best booked babyface on AEW television, in my opinion.
I think Orange Cassidy is one of the best pro wrestlers in the world right now. And I know he was asked about that in the press conference and he adamantly denied it, but for reasons that I explained ad nauseum on our podcast already, I think that Orange Cassidy is one of the best wrestlers in the world.
All right. I think people can understand by this conversation. I could literally talk to you for 5 more hours about this stuff, but you have a job to do. You have some work and you have some podcasts to record. But before we get out of here, I just want you to plug the media school stuff, because that nobody is doing that. Right.
Yeah, now. And not enough people are taking advantage of what
I can imagine it's a hard sell because of the DIY thing that we just talked about. But I mean, you're talking about somebody who you went to school and trained and have the reps and are willing to share information and share secrets about how to do this thing. I'm hopeful that more people get interested in it, because it's somewhere where if more people were thinking like you, I think the podcast industry for wrestling would be going in a much more professional, slant and such. So, but I did want, because, I want you to get this out so more people understand what you're doing.
Yeah. And maybe it's on me. Maybe I need to retool my approach to this. I originally, when I was going to launch this coaching service, I was going to have more of a structured plan in place for, hey, here's what I'll be doing talking about this. Here's what I'll be doing talking about this. But I ended up changing it because I recognized that so many people out there have different skill sets they want to improve on. It's not one size fits all. In my career, I've done what I feel to be pretty much everything in media. I've worked at the national level, the regional level, the local level. I've covered every single sport there is under the sun. I've covered news. I've covered lifestyle. I've been in radio, television, digital, every element of broadcasting, podcasting. So my skill set, I feel, is pretty well rounded that I could help anyone in whatever they want to do. I've had people come at me for advice on interviewing, on air performance, writing, podcasting, whatever it may be. And I offer these individual sessions that you can book where I will tailor to whatever you want to work on. If you feel you need to get better on camera or cut out your ums and your uhs, I'm going to help you with that. If you are a journalist on television who wants to be better with storytelling and writing scripts, I'm going to help you with that. Whatever it may be, I try to tailor myself in these individual coaching sessions to whatever the person needs. So that's my mentality with the Alba Media School. I would love to get more traffic with it. It started really, really hot. I had a lot of interest, and over time it's kind of faded a little bit, but I would love to get anyone who's even just curious, or even if you have no idea where to start, I'm going to help you start. I'm going to help you. I'm going to point you in the right direction. I can help you with equipment. I can help you with all that stuff. So I do appreciate you letting me plug that, albamediaschool.com.
And, it reminds me of when the pandemic happened, Lance Storm, who had just recently stopped his school.
His tape study stuff.
He was doing the tape stuff. And I was just fascinated to learn who was interested in reaching out to him, because I mean, who better to learn fundamentals from than Lance Storm to get him to kind of pick apart what you're doing. And I sort of see the same thing here, which is, this is what I want to improve on. And, here, maybe if you even have a guest, I don't know if you look at tape or you listen to things, small segments of stuff to help people, but what a fascinating way to grow in a career that is, or it's not even necessarily have to be a career. It could just be a passion. I want to get better at this passion.
Most of them are passion.
Yeah. So no, fantastic stuff. Hey man, at some other time, I would love to do more of this, because I think your career is fascinating. I know that, you probably could handle even more projects your way. So, I hope the most success that you could possibly have in this stuff. I like to see people who actually put in the work get the payoff for putting in the work. So I'm always following your stuff. I'm rooting you on no matter what.
Likewise.
And we're gonna have you on. We're live pal at some point again, and I would love to bring you on here, because this stuff, to me, I like talking about this stuff more than wrestling. Don't tell anybody.
Me too.
But okay, we're on the same page with that.
Yeah.
But thanks again, everybody. Check out Jon Alba, the Patreon, Wrestling According to Alba, and then hit Jon up for any opportunities to talk to him in sessions about media stuff. Jon, thank you a ton. We'll do it again.
Thank you so much, man.